Czars, premiers, and presidents. If you know your history, you know that this is talking about Russia. Russia has been a nation of dictators, monarchies, presidents, you name it, the Russian government has experienced that kind of leadership. So what we're going to be going through today is a discussion of two leaders, more so a timeline, so to say, about what happened in each term and what each premier, which is what they were called during the Soviet Union, is known for. So starting off, we're going to be talking about Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev was appointed in 1953, which was the year that Joseph Stalin died. In 1956, he starts to become critical of Stalin, posthumously. He criticizes Stalin's policies, and he also denounced the brutality and the crimes that Stalin committed while in office against the Russian people. Further in that year, we have the Suez Canal crisis, which is conflict between Great Britain, France, and Israel, all against Egypt. The conflict was based around Egypt's plan to nationalize the Suez Canal, and Russia steps in, if needed, to aid Egypt. This then causes the three nations that were just listed, Great Britain, France, and Israel, to back down, and the Suez Canal crisis does not really come anything greater. Then we have the Hungarian uprising in 1956. We have Emre Nagy, who was a Hungarian communist politician who was wishing for more independence for Hungary and also the removal of the Soviet troops from that nation. Khrushchev's response is actually quite the opposite. He then sends more troops in. The Soviet Union actually invades Hungary. Nagy is then arrested, and he is then murdered. With this, we're really able to see what Winston Churchill means when he says, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The Iron Curtain being the power, the ruthlessness, and the ability that the Soviet army leaders have in regards to their satellite nations, which are nations that the Soviet Union are more or less, so to say, protecting, but in a way that most people wouldn't want any protection like that. Then in 1957, we have the launch of the first satellite to orbit Earth, which is Sputnik. And this tension kind of increases between the US and the Soviets, who are currently in a space race. But then following a visit that Khrushchev has to the United States, it's relaxed in a sense. And then 3 years later, in 1960s, tensions are increased again due to the fact that the Soviets shot down a US U-2 aircraft flying recon over the USSR. Now, as we know, during this time, this is some of the most heated moments of the Cold War. So an act like this is really going to divide these two nations even more. And then a year later, there's the approved building of the Berlin Wall, which is to stop refugees from crossing East Berlin into the West Berlin border. Now, East Berlin, as we all know, following World War II, was given to the Soviets to control, and West Berlin was given in three parts to France, Great Britain, and America to govern and keep free. However, we have the Berlin Airlift that is aiding East Berlin and West Berlin, and the Berlin Wall is really one of the big sparking points between the more heated rivalry that there is between the two leaders of the two nations in, quote, war, Khrushchev and Kennedy. Also in 1963, we have the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is when there is word that the Soviets will have planted missiles on Cuba, which is at the time a communist country, and from there, the Americans are trying to respond as best as they can. So really what we're seeing from Khrushchev is large militaristic attacks and actions that are trying to just build up the power of the Soviet Union. And in comparison, we're going to be looking at the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in office from 1985 to 1991. And there are two key terms that we have to understand when we're thinking of Mikhail Gorbachev. And the first is perestroika, which is what he wants to consider as restructuring. This is Gorbachev's policy of abandoning Marxist traditional ideology, so the traditional ideology that created the nation, that sparked the revolution in 1917, and has been at the forefront of what runs the nation and how the nation understands government, while also advocating for free market policies, which were an attempt to raise the standard of living and the economic progress of the Soviet Union. Also, we have Glasnost, which is his policy of openness, and this policy is trying to allow for more freedoms, be it of speech, press, and the ability to criticize the government. Now, Gorbachev is really pushing for these things because at this point we're starting to see the weakening of the USSR. For one, they're bankrupt. They're spending too much money on the nuclear arms race, which what we know is the Cold War between the United States and Russia. Then we also have the power of Pope John Paul II, who is Polish, who aided Poland in the Solidarity movement of 1980. And he is very anti-communist and is spreading those messages throughout the world. And finally, we have the actions of U.S. President Ronald Reagan, who is outspending the USSR in nuclear development, which is at the same time going against them in the Cold War. So what we need to know here is do a little math. The U.S. is able to produce 2 nuclear warheads for every one that the Russians are able to produce. So if we're taking it like that, the Russians are always going to be behind, and in order to try and catch up, they're going to have to create more. But with the lack of funding and money that the Russians have at the time, they would never be able to reach the level of arms that the United States has. And then in 1991, we see the full collapse of the Soviet Union. Perestroika fails. There's a huge unemployment rate and there's a very big scarcity of basic goods that are necessary for life. Then we have the end of Gorbachev's reign because in 1991, Boris Yeltsin is named the first president of Russia.